Hello to you all. I am Peter Dröll, Director for Prosperity in the Commission's Research and Innovation Department, and I am the moderator for this session on research and innovation for the future of work. The future of work concerns all of us as employers, employees, as workers, as researchers, as managers, or as entrepreneurs. So it is a question relevant, very relevant for us. What we've seen in COVID-19 is that the way we work now has drastically changed. More automatization, more teleworking, more digitalisation. Actually, we have seen the trends which were there from earlier on, automatization, distant working, the platform economy, that these trends have accelerated. So our session now is about the work of tomorrow. Let's say in 5 to 10 years from now. How will work in 10 years from now look like? And the objective is to define the role of research and innovation in shaping the opportunities from this digitalization, the digital decade, for the benefit of all of us, of all workers. And it has a double dimension, this question: what are the research topics and what is needed so that the research results generate value for society, for all of us. That is quite a tall order, isn't it? But we have three assets here to go through this. The first one is the overall direction of policy is very clear. We have the digital and green transition, the European Green Deal. We have the recovery program with reforms focused on an economy that works for all. And we have the European social pillar, 20 principles, 3 headline targets on jobs, on skilling, upskilling and skills, and on inclusion. So the policy direction is very clear. Second, what we have here is strong panelists. It's an honor to introduce them to you. So we have here with me Greta Corporal. She's a research fellow at the Oxford University and specialized in social, organizational, and economic implications of platform technologies and artificial intelligence for workplaces. Warm welcome, Greta. Judith Dada, she's a partner in La Familia, a Berlin-based venture capital firm funded by digital entrepreneurs, family businesses, and angel investors. Marwan Elfites, he is co-founder and head of startup services and investments of Station F in Paris, probably the world's largest startup facility. And Joost Korte, the Director General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. He is the key figure for Europe's policy on the future of work, on the protection of workers. And thirdly, as a third asset, we have you, our audience. You can interact with these panelists in this session via Slido. So please connect RI Days EU and answer please to the first poll we have here. We would like to know where you come from, where your affiliation is. So, and please then use Slido to post your questions and to upvote them so that we can discuss your questions, your comments here with the panelists. And at the end, we also intend to do a poll about the next steps and priorities. So thanks for engaging with us with Slido. Are we good to go? All clear? Then let me start with business. Marwan, you are working hand in hand with Europe's next generation of digital innovators. What would you advise an entrepreneur in 2030 Is it the technology or is it the people that matters to be successful?
Well, it's mainly the people. What is really great at StationF, we have 1,000 startups at the same time in 30 startup programs. So it's really interesting because you can compare, you can see, you can do benchmarks, you can see how people behave. And we sometimes have startups on the same field, on the same scope, competing against each other. And what makes the difference are people. So they can rely sometimes on the same tech, on the same kind of solution, but they don't move in the same way because they don't rely on the same organizational structure or on the same human capital. So obviously, human capital is key if you want to develop a great startup.
And do you think it matters, is it just about skills, or you think it matters that the well-being of your employees, the workers, is relevant for a startup, for the startups you see in your daily business?
It is really key because you need to be able to attract talent. And especially when you are a young company with just a few KPI, a few traction, you need to be able to attract the best people. And you attract the best people because of the value prop you sell, so the product you are going to launch or you are already selling, but also on the framework, the HR framework you provide. So, and especially right now, I mean, after what happened with the COVID situation, we all need to work in great conditions. And it's really interesting because we got many startups applications they want to apply to some programs, and many of them are offering solutions to improve employees' well-being. So there's definitely a need in that field.
Okay, that's very interesting. Let's hear from Judith. Judith, you're also investing in a lot of companies from forklifts to e-bikes. And my question to you is, how do you see the role of technology in terms of employability and productivity? How important is it in your daily business?
So I would say that for us, it's probably the most crucial trend we've observed over the last decade. I think with everything that we've seen with COVID, there was an acceleration of a bigger trend that we've been seeing happening, or kind of a wave building in the market for a longer period of time. And that's really that human resources and productivity are becoming front and center when it comes to value creation. I think if you think about the cycles in which the world has moved, and one of our founders actually put this really nicely, we're coming out of a world where, if you think about industrialization, it was all about the resources, right? So it was all about the resources in the world that you could harvest, and those people who owned the resources were the people who, were in advantageous economical positions. Then I think like more in the 90s and early 2000s, it was all about the customer, and you had companies like Amazon coming up, and it was all about customer intelligence and who could best serve the customer. And now, with talent becoming such a scarce resource, human labor is really becoming front and center for companies when it comes to being competitive and being productive. And so for us, that really encompasses this bigger trend of the future of work, and really for companies to understand that they need to measure talent, they need to measure productivity, and productivity is not just about the work that people do when they're behind their desk or they're on their feet, working in a factory, but it's got all of these other elements that could be cultural, that could be private, that really kind of enable a person to bring their best self to work and put their best work forward, that I think will drive the competitiveness of companies going forward. And it's really interesting if you think about even just our accounting systems today, right? Like, we account for all of the assets, that we recognize as assets. So we depreciate assets over time. We've got balance sheets to really measure different positions. But when it comes to human talent, we don't really yet have any way of measuring that correctly, or even being able to understand which companies are doing how well on training, retraining, and serving the people that build their products in the end. And so for us as venture capitalists, that's something that we think about a lot. And I think that there's a tremendous opportunity in the market for companies to be serving, automation solutions and really enable humans to do more creative work, work that's really meant for humans rather than repetitive tasks that computers are just much better than us at doing. I think there's a potential in flexibilization of work when it comes to making sure we tap into the lower and lower amounts of workforce that we have, because that's a big trend that we have to deal with, at least in the West. If you look at COVID, birth rates in some countries have shrunk by 10%, which is levels that we've never seen before. That's going to do something to the productivity of the labor force more broadly. So if we don't tap most effectively and efficiently into every single person out there who could do the work, those are women, those are elderly people, really thinking about how we can flexibilize work so that we can bring all of them into the workplace and grow productivity from there. That's one of the concepts that we're thinking about. And then I would say the last concept, is more virtualization, which is, how can we enable anyone, anywhere to work, the best they can. And that, I think, very strongly also plays into the flexibilization aspect of future of work. So for us, these three aspects are really kind of front and center. And I think future of work today is one of the most exciting opportunities for growth and for investment.
Wow, that is a very upbeat statement. Thanks for very interesting points. We will come to that also to the risks a bit later, but let us take it as it is now. We heard from Marwan and you that there is a lot of need and therefore also startups looking into the well-being of workers and the flexibility and that would be the part of the future of work. Very good. Let's see from the academic perspective and look, make a check whether it really is that good, all these digitalization for workers. Greta, you have looked into great detail what's happening in the platform economy, and we've heard and we experience the positive benefits, but let's see also what are the risks we need to address, the spaces to watch. What do you think are the biggest issues we should watch, and what could research innovation do to address these concerns?
Yeah, definitely. I agree that with digital transformation, there's a lot of potential for growth of European economies and to strengthen a competitive position. When we look at what we have started to call the digital transformation of work, perhaps it's helpful to quickly outline these three broad trends that we're observing, these three broad conversations. And the first, as already hinted at, focuses on artificial intelligence, or AI, and the automation of work. And the second conversation is actually about about AI and the automation of the management of the work, or what we have started to call algorithmic control. And the third conversation is about the rise of digital platforms, or the platform economy, and especially the rise of digital labor platforms as new intermediaries in work. And in my opinion, where the first two conversations receive a fair amount of attention in both media and policy, I argue that the third conversation on platform work deserves more attention, because the implications, the transformations in work that are happening here go far beyond automation. And indeed, as you suggested, there is a need to balance this potential for growth and competitiveness with social protection. And in the platform economy, it is here where transformations in work pose great risks. In terms of gig work and platform work, we observe that workers are increasingly employed as contractors, and which is associated with less social protection, such as, for instance, pensions, healthcare, unemployment benefits, as well as things such as being able to get a mortgage to buy a house. As such, while platform workers often enjoy greater freedom and flexibility in terms of when to work and how to conduct the work, they also take on more risk, sometimes more than they can bear. So to unpack this question of how can we balance these two sides of the same coin, I would say, let's take a look at these three elements: the future of work, of workers, and the workplace. So in terms of the first, I think there's a need to better understand what are the work designs and models of organizing that are becoming dominant in the platform economy, not only for blue-collar work or physical in-person work, but also for white-collar work, which is increasingly remote and conducted online. And it requires specialist expertise, as we already hinted at. It is here that a lot of experimentation is taking place, and we definitely should know more about it. So going on, looking more at this meso level, at what is happening inside organizations, around organizations, and how it's being experienced by workers, we really need to better understand who are the workers that are benefiting in the platform economy and who are left behind. What does work mean to them, and how do they experience these changes in the nature of the work and in their careers? And regarding the future of the workplace, well, we all have experienced the impact of the pandemic, as you mentioned in the opening. And companies are now really looking at ways to blend models of on-site and remote work. And so we really need to understand, how can we make these blended workplace models more inclusive? What technology investments need to be made? What does a future-proof workplace look like, in terms of its design? And what new work and management practices are needed to integrate not only the on-site and remote workers, but also accommodate the different employment arrangements that come with it for full-time employees and contractors? Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Greta. That is a very nice transition to my question to Joost, the man in charge of the future of work and social protection in Europe. So, Joost, for you, what are the three main issues you have as concerns in terms of future of work, and what do you expect from research and innovation in these areas?
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for having me here today. I'm very happy to be able to join you in this panel. I think what I would like to say is that what we try to do at the level of the European Commission and the European Union is to set a framework, a sort of a social rule book within which all these very good new initiatives can flourish and develop, and that the other panelists can actually do their work. This needs to be done in a way that is fit for Europe and that also complies with our fundamental values. And this is where I would like to mention the European Pillar of Social Rights, for which we have presented an action plan that was endorsed at the highest political level a few weeks ago in Porto, in Portugal, and which really anchors these 20 principles in the recovery process and in the digital and green transitions. As was said before, I think all these transitions were happening anyway, but it's also true that the pandemic functions a bit as a pressure cooker. And many of these developments are now going a lot faster. It's not that we are developing or we're discovering the future of work now. We've been working on this for a very long time. But things go so fast that there is an enormous need to invest. And that's why we're extremely happy that we can be part of Horizon Europe in our own cluster and profit from the research and that can be done. I mean, 3 points also I'd like to mention, the biggest tickets, and in fact they were already mentioned. I think the first is indeed platform work. The second I would mention is telework. And the third is artificial intelligence. I mean, Greta, in fact, mentioned all 3 of them, so we are fully in line here. On the platform work, we see that this is growing very, very fast. I think the turnover has increased by a factor of 5 over the last 4 years, and it's a very promising sector. I mean, I don't think the Commission has any intention to stifle that sector. On the contrary, we want to support it. But for this to flourish, to be able to also work well across border, we need to set a number of standards, and that's what we're doing. That's what we always try to do in the labor market, minimum rights on which the people who work in that sector can rely on. Also to help the companies themselves, because the companies are confronted nowadays with different rulings, for instance on the question of the status of the workers. Are they self-employed or contractors, or are they in fact a worker and hence protected by labor law? Courts come to different conclusions in the European Union. I think we have 140 rulings today. So this needs to be organized. I don't think the platform companies themselves will be happy to develop a business model when they are confronted with 27 different models. We're not going to harmonize the sector, but we set the minimum rights that should apply to everybody. Telework, equally important, 5% I think in 2019, working from home, 50% today. Here, of course, the pandemic has had a huge impact. What does this mean? It means that the risks also for the people who work have changed. And we now are confronted with a lot more questions about psychosocial impact, work-life balance, right to disconnect, ergonomic issues, how are you working from home? It opens up a whole new book of new issues for which we really need input in the area of research and innovation. And finally, artificial intelligence, I don't need to repeat what was said. This is, of course, a mega trend that impacts enormously on the labor market. I think we're only at the start of this. And that is also why the Commission put forward an Artificial Intelligence Act, and where we will, in the area of the labor law, also come with proposals, starting with the platform economy, algorithmic management. How does this work? If you get an instruction from a computer, if you're fired by a computer, if your contract is ended, how does this? These are new developments again, and where we have a really link between science, innovation, and the labor markets in the European Union.
Thanks a lot, Joost. That's a very, very rich portfolio of issues and questions. Can we zoom in on 2 points which I take from this discussion so far? The first one is the platform workers, their vulnerability, mentioned by Greta. And the second one is perhaps more the question of exclusion. So who will benefit from these new jobs and the new forms of work? And can I ask our representatives from the business, from the next generation of entrepreneurs, Judith and Marwan, in your due diligence and your advice to entrepreneurs who set up a business, does this play a role, the protection of gig workers who would be engaged by the company? Do you see that there are certain skills which are no longer needed, which are no longer present, and where there will be no future opportunities in these new companies?
So very happy to tackle the first part of your question. You know, what role does social protection of particularly gig workers play when we diligence companies, and what advice do we give? I would actually say that the market does a fairly good job of self-regulation, at least at some ends. If you look at what's currently happening in the gig worker economy, if you look at companies like Gorillas as one very prevalent example, because they've raised tons of capital and are growing like wildfire, but there's tons of other companies. If you look at Delivery Hero, the whole kind of restaurant enablement, the reality is that there's more demand for couriers and for gig workers than there is supply. So there is enormous pressure on this labor segment right now, and companies need to do something to attract the best talent because they're becoming a scarcer and scarcer resource. So, we've seen companies that are, kind of iterating on, new worker leisure concepts. So what do gig workers do when they're not actually actively on their bike or in the car, delivering an order? How do you actually, kind of create zones for relaxation, for recharging the batteries, also for socialization, right? For what for us would be the water cooler moment, in the classic office environment. What does that look like for gig workers? How do you, enable them to be able to recharge their batteries? I think these are all questions that are now coming up, and they're becoming real kind of, questions of competitiveness for companies, because there's so much pressure and demand on getting, as many couriers as possible to do the jobs, because the demand for this whole segment has just risen so astronomically that I think, at least from our perspective, there is a lot of kind of, market momentum that is doing, the job of, what I would call regulation, on top of obviously, certain protections that need to be set, on the European level to make sure that workers, get a minimum amount of rights and benefits, no matter, what job they work in. So I would just say that as something that we've been observing very strongly in the market is, for sure, workers need benefits, but I would actually argue that today it's also kind of a good time, to be working in the segment, because the reality is the demand is huge, and I do think that workers in this segment have more leeway than ever in order to kind of pick the employer they want to work for and be able to kind of choose accordingly.
Very, very interesting. Before turning to Marwan, just let me remind you, please, I see the first question on Slido. Please engage, ask more questions, vote them so that we can engage with you after this first round with the panelists. Thanks a lot. Marwan, is that also a trend you see, that the market need is so strong for gig workers that there is a need to take care of their well-being and protection?
Well, the first thing we see is how we can take care of the founders themselves and their first employees, because at Station F we mainly have young startups, really early stage startups. So from the pre-seed phase for the biggest ones to the Series A. So when they come on the campus at Station F, they have 2 or 3 people per company. So they're really small. So the first topic we see is how they can attract full-time employees. How they can attract talents from any countries, from the EU, of course, but also from outside of the EU. So it's one of the first topic of discussions. How can they hire people and not just vendors or contractors? Because it's really tough for young startups who just made a small first fundraising to have full-time employees. So of course the gig economies, we can see it, but for now, I guess the first topic we see from day one at Station F is how they can attract people easily from big groups, from abroad, with a few pain. It's really hard for these entrepreneurs to attract so many people. So having the same, I would say, social conditions, whether you work in France or abroad, is one of the key topics we see every day.
And just for you mentioned the framework and the need for the platform economy. You said not stifle it, but to have a bit of a minimum rules. Is it market demand? Is that confirming that we need to provide this and strengthen this framework? Or can we leave the markets and supply and demand play?
Well, it's clear that there is an enormous demand, and that also a lot of European citizens quite like to be in a sort of a flexible relationship with its employer. I think it's an illusion to think that everybody wants to have a 40-year contract, all the securities go with it. These times are over. So I can understand that. However, it can of course not be so in Europe that people are being exploited, or that you can be dismissed by a computer, or that your relationship with your employer is not well organized, or that you are self-employed but you are de facto a worker. The fact of the matter is, if you're self-employed, you are on average about 50 or 40% cheaper. Why are you so cheap? Because you pay no social contributions. If you pay no social contributions and things go wrong, you're in trouble. You may fall off the scaffolding, or you may have an accident. That's why I think these things need to be thought through by setting minimum rights. A pension entitlement, I mean, the country that I know best, the Netherlands, has an extremely flexible labor market, and it is interesting to see that now they are realizing also the cost it has. That a whole generation of young people who are in this new economy find it impossible to buy a house, get a mortgage, raise a family, and start to wonder what their perspectives in life actually are going to be. So I don't want to dramatize the picture, but I think there is a real issue here in the long term. And my final point here is also, I think the pandemic has again brought another dimension to this issue, because what happened is that in fact the member states had to step in and help everybody who lost a job, whether they are employed or whether they are self-employed or whether they are in the gig economy or wherever. And I think this raises a lot of questions, notably in the offices of the finance ministers. They're bailing out people who have never paid into the system. I think this will make them wonder. What is your entitlement? And I think this really triggered a full debate, which we're in the middle of. I don't know how this is going to end, but our beacon, our compass, is the Pillar of Social Rights, which contains a number of pretty clear principles, which we need to protect and support.
Very clear, Joost. I see Judith nodding, but before turning to you, Judith, Greta, from your perspective, from your research, are these really, you confirm these risks, and do you see already some solutions emerging, apart from the regulatory framework and the rights for workers?
Yeah, let me draw here a bit on the wider research being done within the University of Oxford on the platform economy and within our group. And definitely, I think we should not talk about one future of work. We should talk about multiple futures of work. And these futures, they are experienced very differently by different groups of workers. And let me just outline two distinctions here to clarify that. And one is workers, platform workers, gig workers that do this type of work out of necessity, and those that do it out of choice. They experience it very differently. If you do it out of choice, you're not dependent on the income you make by for instance, being a Deliveroo rider. But if you do it out of necessity, you are. And then you experience, for instance, the algorithms and the freedom and flexibility very, very different. Another one I want to point out is when we look at online platform work, so that's mostly a transnational phenomenon, we see very different experiences of the market dynamics for people with general skills. Think about like the people that work on Amazon Mechanical Turk or, just do simple tasks online. They face global competition from people of all parts of the world and often can ask lower wages than they can because of the cost of living. The other group that is actually really benefiting from this trend and is very attractive to companies, and this is where my research focuses on, is looking at this group of very high-skilled, specialized people, people that often, data scientists, software engineers, they can ask lots of high wages on these platforms because their skills are so in demand and they are scarce. So they can carry the risk, and they are very attractive for companies to bring on board to stimulate innovation, share knowledge, and increase their positioning. So looking at, seeing this as a dimension, 2 by 2, you see very different worlds of work emerging. And I agree with Joost that in view of platform work being largely a transnational phenomenon rather than a local one, it is here that Europe can really set an example in defining the new social contract.
Thank you. Judith, you wanted to come in on this point?
Yeah, I think actually the last sentence was a really interesting one. Is that, how can Europe set an example, especially when it comes to the global nature of talent? And I think that's also something that we've heard before, which is the overall regulations around work visas. Starting from the blue card, to broader concepts around work visas. Within Europe, where I think there's a ton of harmonization needed, but also a ton of flexibilization, because the reality still is, often people who work on a blue card that is, first of all, only available for certain job categories and, come with certain thresholds of income, they're not at the same time also able to work, as a self-employed person or, basically as a contractor, which requires a different set of visa regulations. So I think, from a startup perspective, especially in the beginning, you have an incredibly limited amount of resources to get the job done. So the question for startup is every single second counts and every single euro counts. And I think what Europe has, done in the past sometimes is create a set of regulation that is working towards the right goals for everyone, but at the end ends up benefiting mostly big companies who have lawyers, who have resources to be able to work with the regulation, relocate talent, work with all the different sets of regulation. I'm thinking of my own, previous employer, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Microsoft, the Amazons of the world. They're the ones who can deal with these sorts of regulations, whereas startups that have very, very limited resources that are today employing employees in Italy, France, Germany, but their companies incorporated as a limited in the UK. They want to give employees, share option plans. They want to pay them. Getting that up and going is completely impossible today. It takes startups forever. It's still way too complicated. So what I like to see, social protection being something that Europe stands for and something that allows us to attract the best talent, we need to make sure that we enable the next set of big companies to be able to benefit from this regulation and not, create, regulations like I'm thinking about GDPR, for example, like going after all the right things, but in the end, creating a set of regulation that was a lot easier to follow through for big companies in comparison to small companies. And there's a couple of other examples as well. So I subscribe to everything that was said, but I think to enable Europe to really be, the central hub for talent, no matter where they are in the world, if they want to work virtually, and it's basically just a cash outflow from Europe to, let's say, Nigeria or Pakistan, or if it's an actual relocation of talent, I think we need to create a set of regulation that allows innovative small companies to really be at the forefront, protecting workers, but also making sure that they don't drown in the set of, different rules and regulations that are then being put on them.
That was a very powerful plea for the social pillar, the European social pillar, mentioned by Joost, leading the way globally and being a magnet thanks to social protection of all workers. Let me briefly come to automatization. How do you see that? Is it really, in your experience, and this to all four panelists, is it replacing more work than generating? And do we have there a risk of going into a system where, as Harari put it very provocatively, there's a useless class coming up which is no longer needed in the future of work? Who would like to start? Perhaps Greta or Marvin?
I can go first. I can draw a bit on history and a bit on work from colleagues. And history tells us that technological change only created more jobs rather than less. Is that a guarantee for the future? We don't know, but that's what has happened in history. When we look at studies that are being conducted now by colleagues worldwide on the adoption of AI in organizations, we actually see that to make the AI work, you actually have to put in a lot of work. So it might automate certain things, but it also creates a lot of extra work tasks to make the automated part function. And that's something that is often overlooked in the design of these new technologies, but is definitely showing up in their implementation.
Excellent. Joost?
Yeah, I can maybe add something. I very much agree again with what Greta says. I think we should not be too afraid of the impact of automation on the number of people employed. I think studies of the OECD are around 8% potential jobs impacted or job losses. But is that such a big problem for the European Union? I'm not so sure, because we have a shrinking working population. And I think earlier on in the panel it was said we already have too few people today. So I think it can also actually increase labor productivity, and it can also help people get out of pretty boring jobs, repetitive jobs. So I think we should embrace this. And as with previous transitions, the Europeans tend to be pretty good at it, and still have a social security net that avoids, that people really fall between the cracks. I think the best we have in Europe is people. Human capital is what we have, and we need to invest and use them. It's a scarce resource. Talent is a scarce resource, and we need to use it for those parts of the industry and sectors where we generate prosperity for the future. I mean, we don't have much else than people in Europe. But I'm not in any way defeatist or somber. I think we have a very bright future ahead of us, and in particular for young people, many good opportunities.
And this discussion shows that. Marvin, in your daily, with the companies you're investing in, do you also see that there are more innovations which are labor enhancing and fewer innovations which are labor saving?
Well, it's hard to say. What I can say is that, of course, many startups we have, they work on automation, they work on AI, they use machine learning, and the big trend we spot is, of course, startups that are working on software as a service, on productivity tools, on all kinds of jobs. How can you improve daily tasks of HR, of sellers, of marketing folks? So, of course, it's a way to improve their, I would say, their working days, because you can automate so many tasks through the tools that startups can provide. So, and of course, if you don't go as Europeans, other ecosystem will do it. China, the US. So you need to do it. And to me, the main topic is as Judith mentioned, it's on human capital, is on how the local ecosystem, so Europe, can attract talents. Can we have some tech workers visas in the EU? Can we attract some non-European talents with a fast track visa for them to come and work for European startups? So to me, this is the key topic, the key element.
Very good. Let's move now to the Slido questions, and we do that in a new form, very telegraphic. Any one of you panelists, please come in. The first question, but in telegraphic style. The first question is, how does the debate on working time progress, also relating to algorithmic management and gig work? So who will define when and how long people work? As we all seen, we have to be anywhere, everywhere. Telepresence.
Shall I make an effort?
Yeah, please.
We have a working time directive in the European Union. It dates from the 1990s, I think. Very long time ago. And it says 48 hours maximum hours per week. It gives everybody also minimum entitlement to holidays, and it has an individual opt-out. So people who want to work more than 48 hours, and they can opt out of this system. Those are the rules as they are today. And of course the big question is, what do we do now when people work at home, when actually the number of hours worked is perhaps less relevant than the output, the result. I think we're entering here, Peter, in a wholly new debate. We will come out next year with a report on these questions and also on how the working time directive is being applied in the member states, but I can already see important demands to have a fresh look at this. I can also see it in my own, I'm also a manager of a fairly large administration, and we are now thinking about how to register the working time of people, also the time of the day they can work. It's all very much organized today in the Commission, but of course with teleworking, people start asking questions. But then also we need to be careful that we do not expect, certainly as managers, that our staff is always available. So you should maybe say after 7 o'clock in the evening and till 8 o'clock in the morning, you can work if you want to work. Go ahead, be my guest. But you should not send emails or call anybody and expect that the others are also around.
Yeah. Greta, do you see any best practice somewhere in terms of working time in the gig economy?
Well, when you're employed as a contractor, you should have a right. There should be a right of a contractor to decide when and where to work. Otherwise, you're treated as an employee, where people try to control you, and there's a risk of co-employment. When I look at white collar work, like knowledge intensive work, and the pandemic, people working from home, they already had more autonomy and flexibility in deciding when and how to work because they had to balance it with their home lives. And what we've seen is many companies and corporations have increased their revenue during the pandemic. So giving workers more autonomy in how to do the work has actually shown that it's not a big risk. It's actually a big opportunity for companies. And I hope that's really being taken forward as we move towards more blended models, that companies allow the workers to choose what is the mode of work that works best for them.
Mm-hmm. There was a very nice, thanks Greta. There was a very nice question. Who should be around the table to define the priorities for the future of work? And that is a question, one sentence per panelist. Who should be around the table? Who do we need? Entrepreneurs? Judith, who would like to start?
I would have actually said everyone. I think the core thing about the future of work is that it touches on all of our lives, and it should touch on all of our lives. It should touch on the lives of people who today are in the workplace as much as the people who today are outside the workplace. It should touch upon the people that today are in positions of power as much as the people who today don't hold positions of power. Because I do think if we want to create an inclusive workplace of tomorrow, then everyone needs to get a voice. And by everyone, I actually mean everyone.
Something to add here?
Maybe, if I can. I think Judith said what I would also have said. I would like to single out the social partners. who have a very important role to play here. And who are very important for the European Union also. When we prepare legislation, we always consult the social partners. So it's what we're doing now on the initiative for platform work. We've just last week launched the second stage. And the idea is very much that they take this forward at their level, precisely because we do not want to have one size fits all. It's impossible. Many of the issues that we discussed today, I think, are best dealt with actually at the work floor, between the employer and the employee, also to protect Judith's, your small companies, micro companies, startups. They can't deal with all this complicated legislation. So the more that's taken forward at that level, the better it is. And we at the EU level will fix the frame, but the frame will be broad, and it will contain minimum rights from which nobody can derogate. So we have nobody left behind, but still leave all the flexibility that is needed to generate growth, for companies to blossom. It's very important.
Thank you. It's time to close this session. Thank you. Voted on which of the topics European research and innovation should focus on. This will be a very relevant input for us as we prepare the next investment packages under Horizon Europe. What I take from this session, and I would really like to thank all panelists here heartfelt thanks, is that we have a very strong action on the European social pillar to provide the framework, as you said. We see that the startup companies, they deal with well-being of workers, and there is, due to the demand in gig workforce, for example, it's just one example, there is the companies will provide solutions which also look into when workers should be absent or have their privacy, what the well-being of workers more generally. We heard that, judging from history, the big automation we see now, judging from history, there will be more jobs created than replaced. So there is a positive spin. And when I look at the Green Deal transformation, we are looking here at a systemic change. There will be quite some substantial changes, new businesses, work-intensive new forms of mastering this transition to sustainability. So there is reason to be optimistic, and from the research and innovation side, we will accompany this process in order to invest with all of you in shaping the future of work for the better of every worker. With that, thank you all very much.